After hearing the horrifying news that Martha Moxley had been found murdered, Georgianne telephoned Ethel at Hickory Hill. Ethel was a nervous wreck. She said, "We can't let this touch the Kennedys." Who gives about the Kennedys? Somebody is dead. The little girl was beaten brutally and seemingly more, if you look at the state of the body. And for Ethel's first response to be like, "Can't let this touch the Kennedys." Who cares about the Kennedys? Who cares about the Kennedys? The little 15-year-old girl was just murdered and assaulted and left in her yard like a bag of garbage. Can't let this touch the Kennedys. Ethel is just a sick, sick person. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to keep going in the other Mrs. Kennedy. Today we've got 2 chapters, and they could not be more different from each other. The first chapter, which is only like 2 pages, is entitled The Zany Playgirl, and this is where we focus on Ethel's overwhelming immaturity. She's still running around in her 50s like a 7th grade boy pranking his friends. So that's its own thing. And then, dun dun dun, we get into Martha Moxley. That chapter is significantly darker because we're talking about Rushton Skakel, Ethel's brother, and the fact that his son could have potentially killed their neighbor. So, it's a lot. It's a very, very long chapter. So this episode will probably be longer, and I would love to be able to finish it, but I also only have an hour to record. So I'll do what I can. Hopefully we'll finish it in time. I'd love for this to just be one episode. I will say that this book, having been written and published in 1993, focuses primarily on what was known about Tommy Skakel. Obviously, up to that point, he can't know the future. But at the time of this writing, Rushton Skakel had hired that group to do an intensive study on Tommy to see if he was capable of murdering somebody, hopefully trying to clear his name. There was recent scandal again in the Kennedy family when one of the clan was accused of assaulting a woman and in Florida. And then that led everybody to be like, what's going on with those Kennedys out of control? Hey, do you remember when Ethel's nephew was potentially part of some kind of murder? And so that led all these eyes back on Tommy when quite a few people had forgotten that the whole Martha Moxley, Tommy Skakel thing had ever happened. So then Rushton Skakel goes and he employs a company to sort of give this psychological screening of his son to sort of clear his name. But at the time that that was happening, this author, Oppenheimer, did not have any access to that information, though he does talk about it having happened. When we read Ask Not, those records were available to some extent for that author to look at. And Callahan had a lot more about the results that were found in that examination of Tommy Skakel and in that sort of comprehensive study of his personality. Interestingly, this book says the company that was hired to look at Tommy says that the evidence they had conclusively absolved him of any guilt. Yet they would not give this information to any lawyers or police or anything like that. So that's curious that you would have like hard proof that this person couldn't have done it, but then you don't give any of that information. Yet, when we read about what the findings actually were and Ask Not, it did not seem that it was conclusive that Tommy had done it. In fact, it seemed the smoking gun that he had, maybe not the smoking gun, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but it certainly raised more questions than answered about his personality. So if you want a little bit more, after you watch this episode, and if you did not see my Ask Not coverage, you want a little bit more information about that study and what was found about Tommy Skakel and the questions that were raised about his personality after the psychiatrist had talked to him, you might want to go and watch this episode because this episode is very helpful. But just wanted to throw that out there before we get started. All right, let's go ahead and start this silly chapter, Zany Playgirl, before we get into the Martha Moxley stuff. This is chapter 105, and it begins like this. Ethel, approaching 50, continued to act in as capricious and kooky a manner as ever. My mother's not involved in anybody's life except her own, David told his friend Nancy Alexander, a born-again Christian and a hairdresser. We have a whole slew of people raising us, and she's not one of them. My mother loves to be busy. Just look at People magazine, and you'll see her playing tennis and skiing, but she's not around for us. What a scathing indictment of her motherhood from her son. On one of her frequent ski trips to Mount Tecumseh in New Hampshire, Ethel suffered a painful leg fracture. 2 expert skiers who were behind her saw the middle-aged jock do a cartwheel and land on her back on the icy steep slope. Please help me! Oh, it hurts so much!" she cried as they came to her rescue. For a couple of months, Ethel was in a cast, getting around merrily in a special wheelchair that was a gift from friends. It had been one of President Eisenhower's old golf carts, and it still had the general's 5 stars on the side. When some old Greenwich friends read about the accident, they laughed. Years earlier, they remembered Ethel, who'd been skiing in Vermont, who had fallen and screamed out in pain. When the ski patrol reached her, she told them she thought her leg was broken. 3 rescuers strapped her into a toboggan and brought her gently down the precarious slope. It was only when they got to the bottom that she stood up, smiled, and jauntily walked off, leaving them exhausted, dumbfounded, and angry. Ethel faked the injury. She just wanted to know what it was like to come down on a toboggan, said a friend years later. In terms of her driving record, Ethel appeared to be racking up as many motor vehicle violations as her sons. It was like the old days in Greenwich. On skiing vacation in Waterville, New Hampshire, a state trooper clocked her doing 84 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. Ethel pleaded guilty by mail and was fined $30. A local newspaper, obviously immune to the Kennedy mystique, said, "Why was Ethel doing 84? Some people spend all their lives under 60 miles per hour. Maybe she had to get the beer. Something like that, probably." When she was nabbed on the speeding charge, a gossip column lumped her in with a couple of fading pop stars who had recently made the news wire for auto-related incidents. 4 months later, David once again was arrested, this time by Virginia State Police, for doing 92 in a 55-mile-per-hour zone in his year-old Toyota. He was held briefly in a Shenandoah County jail, charged with reckless driving and failure to have a driver's license and registration in his possession. He pleaded guilty and was fined $50. While novelist Pearl S. Buck of the Good Earth fame predicted in her curious 1970 book, The Kennedy Women, A Personal Appraisal, that Ethel had the strength and dynamism to become the symbolic leader of the Kennedy family, and the Gallup poll continued to put Ethel on the most admired women list, although she dropped to second-string status by 1974, behind the likes of child star turned diplomat Shirley Temple Black and actress stroke victim Patricia Neal. Ethel was acting more like a zany playgirl than a contender for the matriarch's throne. "Honestly, Ethel," declared the Washington Star's gossip columnist Diana McClellan Cadley, "you can't carry your drink outside. Not even you. Not even in Georgetown. Not even from Clyde's." That was a popular bar. "There are these things called city ordinances, and alas, they even apply to you." Ethel's life now seemed to revolve around her annual pro-celebrity tennis tournament at Forest Hill, which she started in 1972 when the Kennedys suddenly realized you couldn't raise enough money privately to fund the RFK Memorial. From a distance, she also oversaw the memorial's annual Journalism and Book Awards, but playing continued to occupy most of her time. On the tennis court, she once bounded through a tough match, suffering from 2 bruised ribs that she'd gotten when Eunice jabbed her during a touch football game a few days earlier. In winter, she skied in chic Aspen with other sparklies, and eventually bought a condo there after her family had trashed a couple of places, and realtors had adamantly refused to rent to her anymore. Spring and summer, she sailed. Reporters from the supermarket tabloids descended on Hyannis one weekend when the Resolute, with Ethel at the helm, capsized and sank after she ran it aground, dumping the widow and her 11 guests into the water. The tabloid crowd had descended because one of those reportedly dunked was Charlie's Angels star, Farrah Fawcett Majors, whom Ethel had befriended at a tennis tournament. And ever so often Ethel, who'd become a darling of the paparazzi set, pulled off a banal stunt or practical joke that became the talk of the Kennedy cognoscenti. One of her victims was singer Neil Diamond, who, while singing his hit Sweet Caroline to some 4,000 guests at a fundraiser on the grounds of the Shriver's estate in Maryland, was suddenly drenched in beer by Ethel because he hadn't sung her requested tune, New York Boy. Ethel, are we for real right now? My great question about Ethel was, how was she part of polite society for so long? I mean, because this is like hardly the first time she's done something so outrageous. What was the deal with her just like spilling drinks over people's heads? I mean, we have so many instances of her doing this. Not the least of when she went over to Andy Williams and poured red wine all over his head, staining a priceless Persian carpet in the process of embarrassing who she calls her friend. And now this guy doesn't sing the song she wants, so she's like, Neil Diamond deserves to have beer poured over his head because he's singing Sweet Caroline. Everyone knows Sweet Caroline. I am at a loss for words. After prominent Washington lawyer Edward Bennett Williams' home was hit by burglars, he received a mysterious telegram saying the loot wasn't as valuable as originally thought. Thinking the wire was from the thieves, William turned it over to the police, who traced the telegram to Ethel. She kept a stack of blank Western Union forms on her desk for just such occasions. That seems like a really nice thing to do to somebody who's had all his things stolen, and then you send telegrams and he thinks, oh good, it's something from the thieves, I'll contact the police. Oh no, it's just Ethel. She doesn't have enough to do with those 11 kids. She's got to send prank telegrams. George Plimpton, having had just undergone gallbladder surgery at New York Hospital, was coming out of anesthesia when his hospital room door suddenly burst open and a 6-foot helium-filled red balloon floated in, compliments of Ethel. Luciano Klausterman, the young, beautiful wife of Los Angeles businessman Don Klausterman, an old friend of Ethel's, had been warned that in order to gain Ethel's respect and friendship, she'd have to pass some sort of a test. What is this, Gossip Girls? I'm sorry. You have to pass a test in order to gain somebody's respect and friendship? I don't want it. I don't need part of your sorry, sad little club, especially when usually the things that Ethel wanted you to do were illegal, wrong, or completely antisocial. All right, well, Luciano hit the jackpot a few days after she arrived at the John Gardner tennis ranch in Carmel, where Ethel was vacationing. After a night out with Ethel and other chums, Luciano volunteered to drive Ethel back to her bungalow. She pulled her rental car to the curb next to a wide patch of beautiful flowers that led to Ethel's place. No, I don't want to get out here, Ethel scolded Luciano with a wink. Luciano got the idea, wheeled the car around, jumped the curb, plowed through the plantings, and delivered Ethel to her front door. We ruined everything, Luciano chuckled later, but I passed my test. Luciano, you pathetic, sad person. You wanted Ethel Kennedy's respect so badly that you just destroyed property, drove over the curb, uprooted all the plantings, and years later you're still chuckling. I ruined everything, but I passed my test. You've got to be kidding me. What kind of an adult are you? On another jaunt to the West Coast, Ethel had stayed at the home of an old friend, Los Angeles Rams owner Carol Rosenblum. After an evening on the town with Pierre Cassette, she discovered that she had forgotten the keys to the Rosenblums' house, and no one was home. Accompanied by Cassette, Ethel tiptoed around the sprawling Beverly Hills house in hopes of finding an unlocked window, ever so often climbing onto Cassette's shoulders, trying unsuccessfully to force one. This is absolutely insane, Cassette had warned her. There's private security. The Beverly Hills cops, probably dogs. We're going to get ourselves killed. When Ethel finally realized she couldn't break through a window, she decided to gain entrance by smashing her way through the door. To accomplish this, Cassette attached the steel cable from the winch of his brawny Chevy Blazer to the 2 huge handles on the Rosenblums' double front doors. Go ahead, do it, Ethel insisted. Pull the damn thing off the hinges. I was laughing, but she was really serious, said Cassette. Later, she acted like one of her big disappointments in life was not pulling the doors off of Carol Rosenblum's house in the middle of the night. I just would have no patience for Ethel Kennedy. None whatsoever. I think the thing is that I, my whole life, have never been a person who, loved practical jokes. It's not that I'm it's hurting people's feelings. It's breaking property. Although I do sort of feel that way. But mostly, it's just dumb. Because now someone's got to clean this mess up. And it's most of the time the people who are receiving the practical joke aren't loving it. It's practical jokes to me seem like very narcissistic forms of humor. And I'm just not here for it. I just could not even. What is up with all these people? Like this Luciano individual who is any opportunity to just wreck property and gain a foothold in Ethel's circle. Who gives a damn about Ethel's circle? It's would that we tried and strived so hard to be part of things that actually mattered. Okay. Now this is where the episode's going to take a turn for the dark, because now it's time to talk about Martha Moxley. And I think that this is a very interesting chapter because it really does go well with the chapter that we got from Ask Not, because Ask Not looked at it from a completely different perspective. More with the assurance and the insistence that Tommy Skakel was the actual person who had killed Martha Moxley. This chapter does not come to those assured conclusions. Yet I feel like what we're getting is just a whole other flavor. And it doesn't really point the finger at anybody. It just is giving us a whole breadth of information about the incident. So I thought this chapter was a great mate for the one that we got from Ask Not. Okay, it's long though, so cross your fingers I can finish. Okay. Stop talking. Halloween had always suited Ethel's prankster style. When Bobby was alive and the children were small, Hickory Hill at Halloween was festooned with ghosts, goblins, and skeletons. Ethel invited her pals and their offspring to lively parties. The little ones passed spaghetti tendrils from hand to hand in the dark, screaming with fear and delight. There were best costume contests, usually won by the Kennedy kids, and bobbing for apples. Overseeing it all was a wildly enthusiastic Ethel dressed like a wicked witch, clapping her hands and egging everyone on. As a side note, how do you have a costume party at your house and then you give your kids the prize for best costume? I mean, her antisocial behavior is just unbelievable. That's not right. Now, if your child truly did have the best costume and it was imaginative and creative and clearly they had the best costume, okay, you can give them the prize. But we all know that Ethel clearly and without apology favored her children in all social situations in which other children were present. So I'm not even saying they probably had to have the best costume to have won at that house. But now, there's only Rory, Douglas, and Max still at an age to enjoy the holiday. And celebration rites had been severely curtailed. Ethel either sent the young ones to friends' homes after a small party at Hickory Hill or let them go trick-or-treating with the governess. But Ethel herself still loved Halloween, and every year she recruited a friend or two to celebrate with her, showing up in costume on the doorsteps of pals in Georgetown or surprising neighbors in McLean. Halloween night 1975, which fell on Friday, October 31st, was no exception, despite the curious comings and goings at Hickory Hill earlier in the day. Something had happened, and Mrs. Kennedy was very upset, very agitated, said Noelle Fell years later. Senator Kennedy, looking very serious, had been at the house, meeting with her in private, and there were all these hush-hush telephone conversations. Late in the afternoon, I happened to overhear her call a friend and say, "You've got to get over here. You've got to come trick-or-treating with me tonight, and I don't want to bring the kids. It's just going to be you and me." You call your friend, a 50-year-old woman, and say, "You got to come over here and come trick-or-treating with me. I'm not taking the kids, okay? So it's just going to be you and me." You don't take your kids trick-or-treating? What are you doing on the doorstep as a 50-year-old woman trick-or-treating? I ask you. Ethel was out to lunch. You got kids. You're letting the governess take the kids trick-or-treating? You're planning on going out. You're going trick-or-treating, but not with your kids. Don't be crazy. Anyway, so she says, Noelle Fell continues, and she says that she had just gone home and she'd gotten her daughter Danielle and a couple of her friends and brought them back to Hickory Hill so that the kids could look at each other's costumes, and Noelle said that she took some pictures. Afterward, they went trick-or-treating with the governess. Mrs. Kennedy, still very distressed, put on her witch mask, got dressed in black, grabbed a broom, and went out with her friend. A terrifying event had occurred that day hundreds of miles away in Ethel's hometown of Greenwich. Not far from Rushton Skakel's elegant home in the exclusive enclave of Belhaven, teenager Sheila McGuire had made a gruesome discovery. Shortly before 1 p.m., while walking through a cluster of evergreens, she stopped suddenly and clasped her hand to her mouth. On the ground under a pine tree was the body of a girl. She was lying on her stomach, her blonde hair matted with blood, her jeans pulled down to her knees. She was 15-year-old Martha Elizabeth Moxley, whose frantic mother, Dorothy Moxley, was searching through the night without success. She reported her daughter missing just before dawn. The McGuire girl, a friend of Martha's, had been participating in the search when she stumbled upon the body. In Greenwich, the night before Halloween was known as Doorbell Night, a time when the local kids played pranks on their neighbors. A pretty popular sophomore at Greenwich High School, Martha had spent the evening with a group of neighborhood teens. Among them was Ethel's 17-year-old nephew, Tommy Skakel, Rushton's son. When police searched the crime scene, which was on the edge of the Moxleys' property, diagonal to the back of the Skakel's house, they found what they believed to be the murder weapon, a broken golf club. The attack had been so vicious and brutal that the club had been shattered. Think about the force it would take to shatter a golf club into pieces. Three pieces, one which was missing. And I just cannot even conceive of the power behind the blow, the anger behind a blow that could break a golf club. 2 pieces were found near Martha's body. The third was missing. Detectives quickly learned that Tommy Skakel had been the last person seen with Martha Moxley that night. A police search of the Skakel home turned up a set of golf clubs similar to the portion of the club found near Martha's body. Tommy Skakel soon became one of the 2 prime suspects in the girl's murder. He had consistently professed his innocence and has never been charged. A year earlier, Martha's father, David Moxley, had been promoted to head the New York office of Touch Ross, one of the Big Eight accounting and managing consulting firms, and had moved his family to Greenwich from Piedmont, California, a small affluent community south of Berkeley. The Moxleys had been attracted to Greenwich for the very same reasons George Skakel Sr. and Big Ann had been years earlier. The town was close to Manhattan, and there was no state income tax in Connecticut. Like the Skakels, the Moxleys had gotten a good buy on their new home, a rambling 3-story stucco Mediterranean with 6 bedrooms and 12 bathrooms, in need of work, on 3 overgrown acres. Dorothy Moxley enrolled Martha and her older brother John in the Greenwich Public Schools and then jumped into the job of renovating and redecorating her new house. "We loved Greenwich from the moment we moved in," she said later. "We felt comfortable. The people were so kind, and Martha loved her schools and her friends. It was a very positive atmosphere." Their community, Bellhaven, had its own private police force, and guard posts kept out interlopers. The neighborhood appeared crime-free. After the Moxleys moved in, their neighbors, Sissy Ix and her husband Bob, president of Cadbury Schweppes USA, threw a cocktail party. Among the guests was Rushton Skakel. Like Ethel, Rushton had gone through hell in recent years. His wife, Anne Reynolds Skakel, had developed cancer during the time Jack Kennedy was assassinated. She suffered until her death at 41 in 1973, leaving him a widower with 6 sons and a daughter. Her illness and death left the children and their father, a recovering alcoholic, traumatized. While Rushton's wife was in Greenwich Hospital dying, Rushton and Ethel's sister, Georgie Ann Terrian, was in an intensive care room down the hall, having had a lung removed because of cancer. Remember, Georgie Ann had been a severe alcoholic her whole life, and she was also a heavy chain smoker as well as a heavy drinker. Rushton Skakel took an instant liking to the Moxleys. He sponsored the family for membership in the fancy Bellhaven Club, and David Moxley for membership in New York's prestigious University Club. "Rush was very, very good to us," Dorothy Moxley said. "In the beginning, he really was just so nice and kind." And I do want to say that Rushton, throughout this whole book, if there was a person who was going to show compassion and empathy, Rushton was always there. He always was reaching out to people. He always seemed like he really cared about people. You'll remember way back towards the beginning of the book when they had that relative in New York who was doing really, really poorly financially, and she and her husband were working really hard, and they lived in the projects. And then her son had killed a little girl and thrown her off a roof. And Rushton didn't act like he didn't know that family. I mean, he was sending checks. He was checking in with them. Like, he really cared about people. So I think it is in his nature to be very compassionate. I think he struggled to be compassionate with his kids. Not that he was mean to them per se, but I think that connecting with them, I think that he was looking for an escape from his own home. I don't think he was super present, especially after his wife's death. I think he was just so sad and so grieving that I think that sometimes there are some people who seem to struggle to show the same empathy and compassion to the people in their home that they are able to give to people outside who they don't feel that they owe something to. It seems as though they feel that they are going to fail on some scale by relating to the people in their home, and that sense of failure, they can't handle that on top of all the grief they're already dealing with. But they know they don't owe that person out there anything, so that person can't feel that they failed because anything they do for that person is gravy. So they are a compassionate person by nature. They do want to do right, but they do it for people outside their home who can never turn around and say it wasn't enough. And I think Rushton Skakel kind of fell into that category because we know him to be a good, kind person, but we don't know him to be an especially good dad. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because I don't know what the deal with Tommy Skakel is. And I'm not saying Rushton was a great dad. Like I said, everyone says he wasn't very present. And he does seem like he really struggled with alcoholism. But I think that if we wanted to sort of look at as to why that was, I think he was just really grieving and not knowing how necessarily to be what he needed to be for his own kids. Anyway, continuing on. After their initial meeting, the Moxleys and the Skakels had very little social contact. Soon Dorothy Moxley began hearing stories about the Skakel boys, particularly Tommy and his 15-year-old brother Michael, who had a reputation in the community for their wildness, just as Ethel's brothers Jimmy and George had years before. They didn't seem to act like everybody else in that neighborhood, she reflected. They just didn't do things like other people. Our kids got up in the morning and went to school, came home at night when they were supposed to, and I was there. My husband went to work and came home at the end of the day. They had a housekeeper and no mother, and Rush was always off somewhere. Every once in a while I'd see one of the children straggling home, but that was about it. Rushton's house was typical Skakel. No one was in charge to establish discipline or controls for the children. It was much like the home Rushton himself had grown up in not far away on Lake Avenue. Because of the problems, Rushton had been forced to hire housekeepers to help take care of his large brood. And like Began, who had retained Martin McNeely to serve as a tutor and a companion for her sons, he had begun hiring teachers from a local private school for the same purpose. The latest was a Williams College graduate named Kenneth Littleton, age 23, who taught science and coached baseball at the nearby Brunswick school where Tommy was a 10th grader. Rushton had offered the young man $100 a week and free room and board. Littleton had started working with the Skakel boys in early October, but it was only hours before Martha Moxley was murdered that he had actually taken up residence in the Skakel house on Otter Rock Road. Like Tommy Skakel, Littleton would become a prime suspect in the girl's death. Like Skakel, he has always professed his innocence and has never been charged. Shortly after the Moxleys moved to Greenwich, Martha entered 9th grade at Western Junior High School, where she was thought of by teachers and friends as an intelligent, confident girl. Known as Mox, she played the piano and took violin lessons. All of the boys found her attractive. She had long blonde hair and blue eyes and stood 5'5". Martha was very popular and very outgoing, recalled Joe Romanello, a close friend and classmate. In the 9th grade yearbook, she was just all over the place. At graduation, after having been at Western less than a year, Martha was voted the girl with the best personality. 2 months before the murder, Martha had started her sophomore year at Greenwich High School. She'd also begun seeing a boy, Peter Zaluka. She talked to him all the time on the telephone. They'd get together at school, he'd come to our house, she'd go to his. They'd see each other on weekends. It was a puppy love kind of thing, her mother recalled. As far as Tommy Skakel was concerned, Dorothy Moxley believed that her daughter had little or no contact with him until a week or two before she was found dead. Martha had gone to a party in the home of a neighborhood friend. She'd stayed out very, very late and didn't get home until 3 o'clock in the morning, Dorothy Moxley said. It was the first time she'd ever done that. After her daughter's death, she found Martha's diary and felt a chill when she read one of her last entries dated right after the party. Martha mentioned that she thought Michael Skakel was okay, but that she knew she, quote, had to be careful of Tommy. I want to say, too, one of the saddest things about the story that this book doesn't relate, but that Ask Not did, is that after Martha came home really late, 3 o'clock in the morning, and she's a sophomore in high school, she came home super late, and her mother had grounded her and said, okay, well, you're not going out again for the little preamble to Halloween the night before when everyone would go out and play pranks. She said, you're not going to do that. But then, she's like, Martha's a good girl. Just kind of ease up on this punishment. And then she told Martha, okay, well, you were grounded, but fine. Just be good. You can go out. And she let Martha go. And I just think that as a parent, to me, that would be the thing that I would go back to over and over and over again. Even if it's irrational, I would think, my God, I had grounded her. Had I just stuck with what I originally told her, she would still be alive. And yes, that's irrational. Like, how many times as parents are we like, okay, maybe I need to just sort of ease up. Maybe the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Maybe I just need to show a little grace here. But it's like that thing that happens. Like if you've ever been in a car accident, you always think, oh my gosh, if I hadn't just, I wish I could just rewind back time. I wish, if only I could just. And as a parent, that's the place where I would go back time and time again in my own mind, as irrational as it would be. I wish I had just stuck with, you're grounded, you can't go out. Anyway, Thursday, October 30th had begun routinely. Martha and her brother John had had breakfast with their mother. Their father was in Atlanta on business, expected home the next day. Almost 2 years older than his sister, John Moxley was looking forward to varsity football practice in the afternoon. The next day, a public school holiday, a big game was scheduled at the Greenwich High School Stadium. Martha, who hoped to be a cheerleader next season, told her mother that she and her best friend, Helen Ix, were going hacking in the neighborhood that night, and that meant spraying mailboxes with shaving cream, hanging toilet paper from trees, innocent mischief. Dorothy Moxley walked the children to the front door and gave each a kiss goodbye. She spent the rest of the day puttering around the house and lunching in town with a friend. Martha got home from school late in the afternoon. Shortly before 7, Helen Ix and Jeffrey Bryn arrived to pick her up. Dorothy Moxley, on the phone in the front hall, heard her daughter debating whether to wear her new shearling lamb jacket or her old down parka. She finally settled on the latter. Over her shoulder, Martha said she'd be home early, waved goodbye, and left. It was the last time Dorothy Moxley saw her daughter alive. Outside, it was now around 7 o'clock, Martha and her pals met up with a few more friends, including Jackie Wittenhall, a neighbor, whose father was president of the National Dairy Corporation. For about 2 hours, they wandered the winding tree-lined streets of Belhaven. During that time, the Skakels were having dinner at the Belhaven Club with their new helper, Ken Littleton. Their father, Rushton, was away on a hunting trip. The group included Tommy and Michael Skakel, their sister, 18-year-old Julie, her friend, Andrea Shakespeare, 16, and a Skakel cousin, 15-year-old Jimmy Terrian, one of George and Georgianne's sons. When they got back to the house around 9 o'clock, Littleton went upstairs to Rushton Skakel's room, where he planned to sleep until his employer returned home. Did you get in your boss's bed and sleep in his bed until he came home? Found that a little weird, but anyway. Minutes later, Martha and her friends arrived at the Skakel house and were invited in. And after a short time, the crowd moved outside and got in a van belonging to the Skakel family. Martha sat in the front seat between Tommy and Michael, listening to music. It was close to 9:30 when Jackie Wettenhall announced that she had to go home. About the same time, Julie Skakel drove her friend Andrea to her house. Minutes later, Rushton's two oldest boys, Rushton Jr. and John, sauntered over to the van to get their cousin Jimmy so they could drive him back to Sursum Corda. Michael joined them, leaving behind Tommy, Martha, Helen Ix, and the Bryn boy. Around 9:30, Helen Ix and Jeff Bryn left for home too. Only Tommy and Martha remained, police later ascertained. It would have taken Martha less than 5 minutes to walk from the Skakel house to her front door. Dorothy Moxley was painting in her bedroom about 10 o'clock when she suddenly was startled by a commotion in the yard. "I think that's when Martha was being killed," she said later. "I heard all this noise. I didn't hear Martha screaming. I heard voices, and I heard the neighborhood dogs barking. If that's when Martha was being killed, it may have been more than one person involved. I went downstairs and I turned on the outside light and I looked out the window. But she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Switching off the light, she decided to call it a night. She took a shower, got into her pajamas and robe, and went downstairs to watch television. Around 10:30, her son John arrived home. "You know, it's funny, but Martha's not home yet," her mother remarked. "But I wasn't really concerned," she explained later, because aside from the party a week earlier, Martha had never had a problem getting home at a reasonable hour. Besides, she was off from school the next day. John, however, said that he'd go out and look for her. A half hour later, he returned and said that he couldn't find Martha and went upstairs to bed. His mother returned to the TV and watched the 11 o'clock news and then fell asleep with the set on. Around 2 a.m., she woke with a start, and the TV screen was filled with static and noise. Groggy, she went upstairs expecting to find Martha asleep, but her bed was empty. Growing concerned, the Moxley went back downstairs and began telephoning the homes of her daughter's friends, the Ixes, the Wettenhalls, and the Zalukas. When she learned from Helen Ix that Martha was last seen with Tommy at about 9:30, she immediately dialed the Skakel house, rousing Tommy's sister Julie. It was the first of several telephone conversations she had with her between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Each time Julie said that Martha wasn't there. During one call, the worried mother asked a teenager if she would look in the van in the driveway to see if her daughter might be there. I knew Martha was getting to like beer, and I thought that maybe she had a couple of beers and passed out. Julie checked the van and reported it was empty. Calling back again, Mrs. Moxley asked to talk to Tommy, who came to the phone and said he had no idea where Martha was. The last time she called the Skakel house, Julie suggested that Mrs. Moxley telephone her Aunt Georgianne Terrian. Now, Dorothy says that she'd never met Georgianne, so it was pretty awkward to call her in the middle of the night. She said, "I'd never met the woman. I knew nothing about the Terrians. She was a little groggy because I had awakened her," recalled Dorothy Moxley. "I told her who I was, and I apologized for calling at that hour, and I told her I was looking for my daughter, and that she had been last seen with Tommy Skakel. She said, 'Oh, that darn kid. He's always doing something. He's always into mischief.' She asked me to wait a minute and came back and said, 'No, nobody's here.' I don't know what time this was, but Jim Terrian wasn't home when I called. She asked for my number and told me that she'd call back. She said she was going to go down to the guest house because she said sometimes the kids went there. A few minutes later, she called back and said no, she was sorry, but no one was there either. She seemed irritated at the fact that I might think that Martha was there, but she wasn't mad at me. I think she was mad at the kids." Shortly before 4 o'clock, now frantic with worry, Dorothy Moxley called the police and reported her daughter missing. Minutes later, an officer arrived asking her some questions and looked through the house and in the yard. "He gave me the feeling that he thought that she was just at a friend's house, that she just hadn't bothered to call home," she recalled. "I told him it really wasn't like her and that I had called all of her friends." After the officer left, Dorothy Moxley tried to pull herself together. She thought, kids today are drinking beer, kids are into drugs. Martha could have tried anything. She went into the library and lay down on the window seat, eventually falling into a fitful sleep. I don't know if I would be comforted by the fact that my daughter could have taken drugs and anything could have happened to her. to the point where I would fall asleep. But again, have you ever been so afraid that suddenly you feel this like overwhelming desire to just go to sleep? Like, I've been in situations where I'm so afraid that suddenly all I want to do is go to sleep. So it could be that that's the place where she was at. Also, she hadn't slept very well that night, so I completely understand why she fell asleep. It's just interesting to me. It's just interesting to hear the way parents sort of discuss the comings and goings of the children in the 70s versus the way parents are now. And I do think that, the pendulum has swung from she's into beer, she's probably drunk in someone's car, to, standing over your kid and breathing down their neck every 5 seconds. I think that there is a happy medium there. Anyway, at daybreak, she awoke and saw that Martha had still not returned. She quickly got dressed and walked over to Rush and Skakel's house, where she was greeted in the driveway by their large, snarling mutt, whom she had to keep at bay. I was scared to death of that darn dog, but I thought, I have got to get past him and get in that house because that's the last place Martha was. I finally knocked on the door and talked to Michael Skakel. He said that Martha wasn't there. Then their gardener looked in the van, and she wasn't there either. By the time she got home, friends were calling to see if Martha had arrived safely, shocked when Dorothy Moxley told them that she hadn't. Meanwhile, John Moxley had gotten up. Well nervous about his sister's whereabouts, he had to get to school for his team's pregame warm-up and left the house. By that point, Dorothy Moxley's friends, knowing how upset she was, began arriving. Jean Walker, Marilyn Robertson, Jane Wall. They sat, drank coffee, and tried to reassure Dorothy that Martha was safe. At 12:50 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Jean Walker, wife of Beetle Bailey creator Mort Walker, accompanied Dorothy to the door. Sheila McGuire was standing there crying. "I found Martha," she said. "Where?" Mrs. Moxley asked. "Out under the tree," the teenager said. "Well, is she okay?" Dorothy Moxley asked. "No," Sheila sobbed. As Dorothy Moxley started to go out, Jean Walker grabbed her hand. "Why don't I go and look?" she said. While she waited in the hall with her friends, Jean Walker followed Sheila McGuire into the Moxley grounds. A few minutes later, Mrs. Walker returned to the house. "It's Martha," she said quietly. "She's dead." As Jean Walker went to phone the police, Dorothy Moxley found a chair in the living room where she sat frozen throughout the day, even as the house filled with policemen, neighbors, and friends. Shortly after Martha's body was discovered, David Moxley called home from a phone booth at the Atlanta airport to let his wife know that he was about to board a flight for New York. Marilyn Robinson, who had answered the call, hesitated, and then told him that his daughter was dead. Even in her paralyzed state, Dorothy Moxley thought, why did you have to tell him? That is wild, that person would take that opportunity. The guy's like, hey, I'm on my way home. Your daughter's dead. I'm sure she didn't say it like that, but she might as well have, for all of the shock that it would be and just the inappropriateness of it. Like, let the man get off the plane and get home. And maybe let his wife be the one to tell him? Interesting. Moments later, John Moxley came into the house crying, my sister, my sister. After hearing the horrifying news that Martha Moxley had been found murdered, Georgianne telephoned Ethel at Hickory Hill. My wife told Ethy that the Moxie girl had been hanging out with Tommy the night of the murder, George Terrian said. Ethel was a nervous wreck. Georgianne told her later that Ethel said that she was going to tell Ted right away. She also called her other advisors. She said, we can't let this touch the Kennedys. Who gives about the Kennedys? Somebody is dead. A little girl was beaten brutally and seemingly more, if you look at the state of the body. And for Ethel's first response to be like, can't let this touch the Kennedys. Who cares about the Kennedys? Who cares about the Kennedys? The little 15-year-old girl was just murdered and assaulted and left in her yard like a bag of garbage. Can't let this touch the Kennedys. Ethel is just a sick person. During the course of the investigation, and later, critics asserted the police didn't do all they could to solve the case. To put it mildly. At the same time, some investigators felt intimidated by the Skakel's power. Well, that's just too bad, isn't it? Oh, you're worried about somebody in power? Aren't you more worried about the fact that there's a murderer around and you aren't going to get to the bottom of it because somebody has a lot of power and money? There's always going to be somebody with power and money. You've only got one opportunity in life to do the right thing. Don't bungle it. You got one life to live. And on your deathbed, are you going to think, I'm really proud of the fact that I let money and power intimidate me so I didn't do my job? Anyway, the autopsy, conducted by Dr. Elliot Gross, Connecticut Chief Medical Examiner, showed that Martha had died as a result of a fractured skull and brain injuries. The killer, or killers, in a frenzy, had battered Martha's head with a number 6 Tony Penna model golf club. She'd been hit at least a dozen times and stabbed through the neck with the shaft of the club. Oh my gosh. But there was no evidence of a sexual assault. Well, that's good. But still, there may not have been evidence of a sexual assault, but they certainly humiliated her body, and her probably in life. She was found with her jeans around her knees, okay? So maybe there was no sexual assault, but there was certainly humiliation involved. There had been 2 assaults on Martha, investigators theorized. The first occurred in the driveway of the Moxley home, about a dozen yards from Walsh Lane, or inside the Moxley circular driveway. The more violent of the 2 attacks was believed to have happened some feet away under a weeping willow tree. The killer, or killers, then dragged Martha by the hair through weeds, grass, and brush to the spot where she was found. Near the body, police recovered an 11-inch section of the golf club shaft. Some distance from the Moxley driveway, a smaller piece of the club's shaft was found, along with the club's head. The club's handle was never found. The time frame of the murder, as theorized by investigators, coincided with the noise and barking dogs Dorothy Moxley had heard that night. Combing the neighborhood, conducting interviews, police quickly learned that Martha had last been seen with Tommy Skakel. Detectives Jim Looney and Ted Broski went to the Skakel house to ask questions and look around, but had no reason to get a search warrant. When the officers arrived, the Skakel children invited them in. Their father, still away on a hunting trip, would not return until November 2nd. Tommy told the police that he'd left Martha at 9:30 on the lawn of his house and returned to his house to write a report about Abraham Lincoln for school. But mysteriously, police later checked with the school, and Tommy had never been given such an assignment. His tutor companion, Ken Littleton, said that he had checked Tommy's room about the time Tommy claimed that he was there, and Littleton said he was missing. He claimed he didn't see Tommy until 10:30 that night, when Tommy came into the den where Littleton said he was watching The French Connection on television. Littleton said that the two had a normal conversation during the commercial. Reviewing that night, Detective Carroll thought the questioning of Tommy and Ken Littleton hadn't been thorough enough. The police also never determined what clothing Tommy had been wearing the night of the murder. Also, I thought that Littleton was up in his boss's bed asleep, not downstairs watching The French Connection, but maybe he roused himself from the bed and went down to watch TV. In a storage bin in the house, officers Looney and Brosco discovered part of a set of Tony Penna golf clubs similar to the broken golf clubs, the murder weapon, that was found near Martha's body. The clubs had belonged to Rushton's late wife Anne and carried a tag with her name. In a later report, Detroit Homicide Chief Gerald Hale, who had been brought in as a consultant, stated that Martha had been killed with the 6-iron belonging to that set. The part of the murder weapon that was missing, Hale asserted, was the piece that would have had Mrs. Skakel's nameplate on it. He also noted, based on extensive surveys, that there were, quote, no other Tony Penna golf clubs in the entire Belhaven area. There was never any question that a Skakel club was the murder weapon, said Donald Brown, the local prosecutor. Despite having the golf clubs in the Skakel house, neither Looney Brosco nor any of the other Greenwich officers had immediately searched for other evidence, such as the missing piece of the murder weapon. The reason for this failure was simple. Initially, the Greenwich police could not bring themselves to believe that the murder could have been committed by a local resident. Greenwich, and Belhaven in particular, was populated by wealthy, powerful professionals, not the sort of people who commit such violent crimes. And that naive assessment applied to the entire Skakel clan, despite the fact that their long history of eccentric, occasionally violent behavior was well known to the local police and longtime residents of the community. In the first 24 hours of the investigation, the police were, as Detective Steve Carroll said later, very disorganized. Instead of focusing on suspects, teams of detectives, each looking to make the big caller, eliminated them. One theory was that an outsider, possibly a hitchhiker, had come to the community under the cover of darkness, avoided detection from the private security force, killed Martha, and fled. Several suspects were cleared through lie detector tests or alibis. Oh, okay, you guys. We've all watched way too much true crime. But does even one of you believe that some random individual skulks into the neighborhood under cloak of darkness, avoiding the security teams, and lies in wait out in somebody's yard with hopes of spotting an isolated victim so that they can brutally murder them? Again, remember, there's no sexual assault here, which could have been a motivation. They just brutally murder them, stabbing a golf club through their neck, beating them to the point where the police who found Martha Moxley thought that she was a redhead, not a blonde, because there was so much blood in her hair. And then just kind of like saunters back off into the darkness and like, oh, you never hear hiding her hair. I don't think any of us believe that such a thing could have occurred. There's no reason for somebody to do something like that. Anyway, with outsiders ruled out, the police finally began to focus on locals. One, another neighbor of the Moxleys, was a single 27-year-old Columbia University graduate student who was subsequently cleared. When Rushton returned home from his hunting trip that Sunday, the police were there to greet him. Since the golf club, which was still at the Skakel home, was similar to the one that caused the death of Martha Moxley, investigators proceeded to the Skakel home in an attempt to obtain the golf club, Detectives Looney and Brosco wrote in their report. Since they didn't have a search warrant, Rushton signed a consent form giving the detectives permission to search the house. But the police never made a formal search, according to Tom Keegan, who was the chief of the detectives at the time. The reason, Keegan said, was because, quote, Rushton Skakel was totally cooperative at the beginning and gave us carte blanche inside the house. What? That's not a reason. Detective Looney, who participated in the search, gave a different reason. He said, we were afraid if we asked him, he might have said, get out, and we'd lose the access that we had. That makes more sense. According to Hale, when it came to the Skakels, the Greenwich police were treading lightly. As Detective Steve Carroll observed later, maybe it was the Skakel money, maybe it was their position, but I believe I was subsequently intimidated by them. Well, then you failed. You have failed. If you can be manipulated and frightened and subdued because of power and money, then you should not be the detective of the police force. Police left the Skakel house that Sunday with a number 5 Tony Penna iron that had Rushton's dead wife's name on it. When 6 months after the murder, a search warrant was finally sought by Greenwich police, the state attorney's office rejected the application. The reason? Too much time had elapsed. Well, yes and no. A lot of time has elapsed, but is there any possibility that you might find something? That is outrageous to me. I don't even understand. The naivete that it would take to think that because these people have money, they couldn't commit a crime is wild to me. What fairy tale land are you part of? Okay. And I will say that sitting here in the year of our Lord, 2025, being inundated from all corners of the globe with information about how cruel and corrupt people are, I think that the rose-colored glasses have fallen from our eyes when it comes to viewing humanity with all sorts of naive assumptions of people's do-goodery. But I just have to say that these people are police. They have to know that human beings can be quite evil, even the rich ones. 2 days after Rushton returned home, he took Tommy to Connecticut State Police headquarters where a lie detector test was administered. The results were inconclusive because it was said he had not been sleeping well and was too tired to answer the questions properly. 5 days later, he was retested and passed, according to Keegan. Okay, but why is he not sleeping well? I guess you could say, well, one of his friends was murdered, so that's why he's not sleeping too well. But a person just has to ask themselves, is there not more to it? Fear, shock, anger, and one rumor after another rippled through Greenwich in the days and weeks following the murder. Even Rushton's brother, Jim Skakel, had heard enough conflicting stories to stay out of the matter. Initially, he had contacted a friend who was head of the investigation at Pinkerton, filled him in on the situation involving his nephew and the victim, and asked him to take a look and report back. Just don't get my name mixed up in it, he instructed. He got hold of me a couple of days later and said, it's a complete mess. There's all kinds of wackos involved, all kinds of stories flying around, and that Greenwich police force is screwed up. Don't go near any of it. So I just forgot about it, and I just hoped that things would come out okay for my nephew. Martha's high school friends had heard all sorts of wild stories about Tommy. The rumors were untrue, but inevitable in such a controversial case. Martha's friend Joe Romanello said, in 1975, we were a bunch of teenagers who just didn't remember Chappaquiddick. The stuff hadn't come out about Jack or Bobby, so we weren't biased at all. But at the same time, we said, there's a lot of money here. This is Ethel Skakel Kennedy's family. This is the Kennedys. There hadn't been a murder in Greenwich in years. It shocked the conscience of the town. I can remember going to the football game that next day, and they had a moment of silence, and everybody was a mess. The adults were worrying about their children and the effect of the murder that it was going to have on us, and trying to cope with something that most people who lived in that kind of environment just never had to deal with. Having grown up in Greenwich, it's very insulated. It's an antiseptic town, real New Englandy. Very wealthy, very staid. A town that doesn't like to air out its laundry. Not long after the murder, having heard of all the rumors, Romanello, who later became a criminal attorney in the Greenwich area, went to Greenwich police headquarters with 4 or 5 of his friends from Martha's school. We were just very confused, very upset with the whole situation, and nothing seemed to be getting done, Romanello said. We'd heard a lot of rumors about the Skakels, so we went marching into the police department and we demanded to see the head of the detective division, Tom Keegan. We told him all the things that we'd heard, and he was very upset. I remember thinking, we must be right, because why would he get so angry at something like that? Maybe that was a wrong conclusion, and now, years later, I'm an attorney and I wouldn't draw that same conclusion. We also hit him with the fact that this kid had left the country. He said, "Do you know what Tommy Skakel looks like? Did you ever meet him? Do you know who he is?" He was very upset. That how could these kids get this information? How the hell did they draw the conclusions that they were drawing? And also, my God, if they know, everyone else is going to know. The man seemed obsessed with trying to find this girl's murderer, and he seemed frustrated at his inability to do so. 2 months after the murder, Greenwich Police Chief Stephen Barron publicly blamed the rumors on, quote, the shock that results from a crime of this nature. He said Martha's murder didn't happen, quote, because of the kind of town we have. This kind of crime happens because there are people with serious problems. Everything that can be humanly done is being done. I still have confidence that the case will be solved. Well, not at the pace they were running. It wasn't going to get solved. Let me see. How much more of this do we have? Because it may be. Yes. All right, my good people. I have reached my hour of recording. So I think this is actually a good place to stop, because we're going to be getting into the investigation turning to look a lot more strenuously at Tommy. So up until this point, it's been dilly-dallying. It's not been, getting the search warrants on time. It's not been doing the things on time. And so there's been all sorts of people who've been quite upset about the way things have been going. And I don't blame them, because I would be upset too. But in the next section, they're going to really start taking a hard look at Tommy, and they're going to come to some conclusions. So I think that's a great place for us to start for the next episode. Also, in that next episode that we'll be doing that will conclude this Martha Moxley situation, we'll be talking about the Smith relative of the Kennedys who was charged with assaulting a woman, and then there was a court case. And that ends up shining light back on Tommy when he thought he had been absolved and, he was no longer a suspect. More people began asking questions again. And so the difficulty that Tommy has had in his life, sort of trying to get back up on his feet. We're also going to talk about that tutor that they had who was living with him, that Littleton guy, and how his life was destroyed by this as well, because he was also pointed at as a suspect. And it seems that the evidence to convict him seems fairly sparse as well. But his life was ruined nonetheless. So we'll talk about that as well. But there's actually quite a bit of this chapter left, so we're just going to have to move that to the next episode along with the next chapter. Thank you guys so much for sitting with me for part 1 of this story, and I will see you again later this week. Bye.